One bites the dust. Italy's Prime Minister loses a referendum on reform and offers to resign, plunging Italy and Europe into more uncertainty. Good evening from outside the Prime Ministerial Palace in Rome. Prime Minister Matteo Renzi was hailed by many of his European colleagues as the fresh, bold face of the embattled EU. Everywhere else, the centre-left was folding under the onslaught of populism from both left and right. But in Italy, the 41-year-old dynamic Renzi stood tall. Until last night, he was dragged down by that most dangerous democratic device, the referendum. He wanted constitutional change that could finally drag Italy into the 21st century, but lost to a coalition of extreme right-wing regionalists and anti-establishment anarchists. Can any of them now fill the political vacuum? And after Brexit and the rise of populism, can Europe cope?
Of course we can cope, say the politicians here in Brussels, even as Germany's central bank chief warns of an ominous development if Italy doesn't undertake economic reform.
Here in Britain, 5.5 months on, our own referendum is still being resolved. Supreme Court judges determining today whether Parliament should take the decision on triggering Article 50, which would start the process of leaving the EU. Despite all the abuse led by the Daily Mail, the first day of the hearing on camera has been dignified and actually unexciting. Tonight, we talk exclusively with the Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, about the economic consequences of the last decade of political turmoil across the Western world.
The level of anxiety that households feel in this economy, in other economies, is the fact that it has, for them, been almost a lost decade of growth.
And the government report into segregated communities is accused of missing the point, as its author suggests an oath of allegiance would help integrate immigrants into Britain. Is the truth that areas become dominated by immigrants because the white British people leave when they arrive?
People do stick to their own quite a bit, like, it's, when they're in front of you, talking foreign languages and stuff like that.
Everybody's just doing what they need to do to survive, and I think from the outside they kind of want to build this atmosphere that there's this big divide.
So first Britain, now Italy. No EU membership at stake this time, but the Italian Prime Minister Matteo Renzi has followed David Cameron's example and resigned after losing a referendum over his plans for constitutional reform. His country has been plunged into crisis and the EU is having to weather yet another political storm. Here's my report. Mayhem after midnight in the Roman palace that Italian prime ministers call home and office. Enter Matteo Renzi and his wife Agnese, or Agnes. She's asked to stay by the door. Yes, he was the future once, until 12:30 last night, when Italy's youngest prime minister ever decided to resign because the biggest gamble of his 1,000 days in office had ended in a failure as spectacular as the chandelier above him.
Nella politica italiana non perde mai nessuno.
In Italian politics, no one ever loses. They may not win, but no one ever loses. But I am different. I have lost, and I say this with a lump in my throat, because we are not a robot.
And so he resigned. But even this homage to his own human frailty smacked of arrogance. He was, after all, never elected, not even a member of parliament. Renzi had stormed to power 3 years ago by knifing the last prime minister in the back, only to run into the sharp blades of the referendum. Well, during the campaign, during this passionate campaign for the referendum, Renzi always said that he was the last man standing in Europe's centre-left. Well, now he's the last man falling. He just resigned a few minutes ago. And this country is now faced with huge uncertainty, as indeed is the rest of Europe. Renzi no longer tweets, they chanted outside with glee. Yes, Italian government's falling is about as unpredictable as Christmas. But this time things are different, because Italy's economy, the third largest in the Eurozone, is woefully fragile, and Europe is feeling woefully besieged. The decorative guards outside the Prime Minister's palace may be inscrutable, but Rome awoke to the realization that the poorest parts of the country had voted overwhelmingly against reform, as had young people, 40% of whom can't find a job. Sandro Gozzi is in charge of Europe policy in the outgoing government.
It is a vote of resistance to change and a vote of disillusion, of deception, of social rage.
Could this be another step in the unraveling of the European Union, which so many people have been talking about this year?
Europe must get out of the status quo. Our European politics was aimed to this, to save Europe by changing Europe.
But they can't even save Italy by changing Italy. So is the man with the dancing hands the biggest winner of the Prime Minister's defeat. Beppe Grillo, the comedian who heads the Five Star Movement, the second biggest group in Parliament. Anti-Brussels, anti-Euro, anti-banks, anti-establishment. And according to one of his MPs, pro-grassroots democracy 24/7.
The people are now savvy. They have now understood that true democracy is a daily personal responsibility and an all-enveloping exercise.
Time to leave the torrent of words outside Parliament and seek some wisdom. Has Renzi just done a Cameron? Referendum, hubris, defeat, resignation.
In a way, it's a very similar situation. De facto, it's something bigger, less important for Europe, but bigger because Renzi has undervalued the complexity of Italy and overvalued his capabilities. He thought that he could resolve his original sin of not having been elected with a referendum, so a surrogate of a popular vote. And that was not forgiven by the electorate, because I think that Renzi didn't understand the reality of Italy, of Italian society.
Which is suspicious of change and proudly conservative. In Rome there is so much past, it's always hard to imagine a new future. And we've just heard from the Quirinale, that's the President's palace, that the Prime Minister did indeed hand in his resignation, but the President asked him to stay on until the budget will be passed. That's about a week from now, we think. I should also point out the markets here moved a little bit, but essentially they kind of started the day where they left off on Friday, as did the euro. So not much of a change, none of that market disaster that some people here, including in the government, had predicted. Now, joining me now is Manlio Di Stefano, an MP from Italy's Eurosceptic Five Star Movement. Welcome to the programme. So you got what you wanted. The referendum was defeated. Renzi has resigned. What now?
New elections. That's what we're asking for. I mean, they did all they could do, and now he resigned, and we need to ask people what they want for the future. And I think that this is the moment.
But what was wrong with the reforms? I mean, people have been talking about the need for reform in this country for decades. Surely it's time that Italy streamlined its government, downsize the second chamber, don't duplicate what the lower chamber does, get with the programme.
They try to reform 47 articles of the Constitution, and in the Constitution it's written that you have to modify it for small parts so that you can follow what happened after the reform. And what this country is asking is a good reform, not of the Constitution, but of the labor market, of the anti-corruption laws, and all these big issues that we have been bringing on since decades now. Right. So I don't think that this is what the Partito Democratico asked in the last elections. They had not the constitutional reform in their own electoral program, so people understood it and they just pushed them back.
But if there is an election, if your party gets elected, are you actually ready for government?
We are more than ready. I mean, we started 3 years ago in the parliament, and at the very beginning...
2 years?
3 years ago.
Right.
At the very beginning, they said that we were just a protest. Then now everybody recognized that we have a lot of good ideas, that our electoral program is very looking forward. I mean, we have a very good electoral program, and we demonstrated that with passion and willing to represent in a good way people, you can do a good politics.
But if the banks now collapse or falter as a result of this, would you be okay with that?
Obviously, we don't, but as you see, look at the stock exchange or the markets, nobody's taking care about the resignation of Mr. Renzi. I think he overestimated himself.
Right, but you have said that you want to take Italy out of the euro, that you want to have a referendum on the eurozone, in or out. Are you serious about that?
Obviously, because the big mistake that was made by Mr. Prodi, the president at that time in 2001, was to bring Italy into the Eurozone without asking people. So all the crisis that we are living now, that is fault not just of the Eurozone, but also of the bad politicians that we had, was made also of this. So now we cannot do the same mistake. We have to ask people, and we will act like they want.
Okay. Manu Di Stefano, thank you very much indeed for joining us. Well, as we've said, Italy's political problems could have wider implications for the entire Eurozone. EU finance ministers have been meeting in Brussels today, and our foreign affairs correspondent, Jonathan Rugman, is there. Jonathan.
Well, Matt, the reaction of European leaders has been pretty predictable. It's a sad decision in Italy. It's a democratic decision. It's a decision which has to be respected. It is not the end of the world. But listen to Jens Wiedemann, the governor of the German central bank. He said this today: it has to be feared that reform activity in Italy will slow down again, and that would be an ominous development, not just for Italy. Ominous for the euro itself, and ominous too if a government without a mandate in Italy cannot control an Italian banking crisis with hundreds of billions of euros of bad debt. A bit of a contrast then with what they're saying here in Brussels today. Viewed from across the Channel, the British usually see themselves as the biggest fly in the Brussels ointment. Today, though, it was Italy's turn. But just as it isn't precisely clear what Italians are protesting against, politicians from across Europe are seeing what they want to see in last night's referendum result. Eurozone finance ministers were meeting to focus on another member of the continent's awkward squad, Greece and its economic reforms. And even if Italy's banking crisis might seem as ungovernable as Italy itself, nobody here was saying so.
I think there is no reason to talk of a euro crisis, and there's certainly no reason for anybody to conjure one up.
I'm very confident in the capacity of the Eurozone to resist to all kinds of shocks. I think that we have now a very solid system, a solid governance, a strong banking union, so I'm confident.
So crisis, what crisis? The talk in public here of no danger to the single currency, of more integration, not less. Even if Italy's vote, along with that for Brexit and Trump, may mean more rebellions to come in elections next year.
I think that everyone who is sure about the outcome of the elections in the Netherlands, Germany and France will probably be wrong. It's very hard to predict. The only thing we know is that voters are much more on the move as they were some years ago.
So you don't feel like Nero fiddling while Rome burns? In the sense, here in Brussels, events happening in individual states, undermining the European project.
You know what I think? I think the bigger problem that Europeans are facing is that we are navel-gazing when indeed the rest of the world is requiring a strong European response. Because it's naive and a complete fiction to think that today's challenges, that a national response is enough.
Thanks to the Italians, the party celebrating the far right's defeat in Austria last night was over for some pretty much as soon as it had begun. The victor, Alexander Van der Bellen, the first Green head of state in Europe, warning me against any complacency. Is this the end of the far right in Europe, do you think?
No. The struggle goes on.
The struggle goes on, he says. While Austria's far right is convinced that the traditional way of life here is under such threat from Muslim immigration that victory will eventually be theirs.
The whole revolt of the silent majority against the elites is too strong. The Trump effect is still doing a lot to Europe. We have the election in France, and I think that the whole metapolitical and cultural change in Austria is something that cannot be stopped.
There's an election coming in Germany too, with Angela Merkel seeking a fourth term. Her reaction to the Italian referendum pretty much the same as what she said about David Cameron and Brexit.
I'm sad that the referendum in Italy didn't turn out as the Prime Minister wished, because I always supported his reform policies. But it is, of course, a domestic Italian decision that we must respect.
And tonight, the French Prime Minister, Manuel Valls, announced that he was running for president, hoping he can unite a divided left against any populist uprising by the Front National in France. So if you thought this year was a political roller coaster for several nation-states, just wait until next. Jonathan Rugman, Channel 4 News, Brussels.
Well, they've had 63 governments in Italy, in that building behind me, in the last 70 years. That's almost one a year. And if they go to a fresh election and the Five Star Movement win that election, they'll have number 64, and that could be led by a professional clown. No joke. Over to you, John, in London, for the rest of the day's news.
Here, one of the most important constitutional court cases in legal history has begun in the Supreme Court. For the first time in history, all 11 judges are sitting together to decide whether the government must give Parliament a vote before starting the Brexit process. The highly charged nature of the case was emphasised when the President of the Court warned that threats of serious violence had been made against those who had brought the case against the government. Our political editor Gary Gibbon has this report.
Nigel Farage originally threatened 100,000 marchers would besiege the Supreme Court today. Instead, some pro-EU demonstrators turned up, shouting, "Nigel, where are you?" Nigel, where are you? The last judges to consider whether MPs should vote on Brexit were vilified by some pro-Brexit newspapers. The 11 judges of the Supreme Court know they too are under scrutiny, accused of being too close to Europe by the Daily Mail. Family members who've tweeted support for Remain, ties to European institutions, or in one case, owning a house in Italy. The President of the Court said he'd asked if anyone involved wanted any of the 11 judges to stand down from this case.
All parties to the appeal have stated that they have no objection to any of us sitting on this appeal. This appeal is concerned with legal issues, and as judges, our duty is to consider those issues impartially and to decide the case according to the law. That is what we will do.
The Attorney General told the judges Parliament didn't need them to insist they vote on Brexit. It could sort itself out.
This is all about standing up for Parliament. I say Parliament can stand up for itself.
This is my friend, my friend.
Outside, political rows spawned by the referendum were rerun. Inside, the government's lawyer found his arguments challenged by the judges. If going into Europe required MPs and ministers to act, didn't leaving need both?
Put very simply, one of the arguments that you will have to deal with is if our accession was the result of joint effort, should our departure not equally be so?
Well, my Lord, the submission I make is that the joint effort, as it were, in the 72 Act is a joint effort in the sense that it assumes that all the prerogative powers continue to exist and be operated.
The court is live streamed. Hundreds of thousands were expected to tune in, but this is not US blockbuster courtroom drama.
You have a set of files called CA.
On the electronic bundle.
On the electronic bundle, it's 1697.
It's 543.
I think it's bundle 3, tab 5. I think that's the...
No, it's volume 5.
It's volume 5.
The odds still seem pretty stacked against the government in this case, and they've got a super short bill just about ready to be fast-tracked through Parliament if they lose here when judgment comes in January. But Theresa May's been telling European leaders she still thinks she can keep to her timetable, delivering Article 50, Britain's notice to leave Europe, by the end of March, if not a few weeks earlier. Gary Gibbon, Channel 4 News at the Supreme Court.
Well, I'm joined now from Sleaford in Lincolnshire, where a by-election is taking place later this week, by the former UKIP leader Nigel Farage, and from Westminster by the long-serving Conservative MP and former Cabinet Minister Ken Clarke. Ken Clarke, in a year in which we've seen Brexit and now this Italian vote. Does it feel to you as though the EU is imploding?
No, because the Italians are amongst the most pro-EU populations in Europe. The Italian vote was about lots of other things. They were protesting about the euro, which they blame for their economic problems, but anyway, that's Italian politics, and I respect their decision. There is certainly a mood of angry protest throughout the Western world. I mean, Trump, Nigel Farage, who's with us, Beppe Grillo in Italy, and others, they're different country by country, but in common they have this angry, anti-political establishment. Life is very difficult, life is complicated, simple solutions that they're advocating. But we're rather Brexit obsessed in this country, which is very understandable, so we should be in the present situation we've created. There's a slight tendency to read across to other countries. Austria could be interpreted as a pro-EU vote, but it wasn't. There are other things in Austria, but there the populist right was defeated.
Nigel Farage, you keep warning that things are going to get even bumpier. What do you mean?
Well, what I mean is this. I mean, it's all well and good for Ken to talk in the terms that he does, but he's missing something. We're not just angry across the European Union, we're recognising the failure of this project, whether it's the Eurozone, whether it's the migrant crisis, whether it's youth unemployment, any measure you want, government from Brussels isn't working. And what is happened in Brexit, happened in Italy yesterday, and almost happened in Austria with a genuinely far-right candidate. What is happening is we're saying this: we want to live in nation-state democracies. We want to trade with each other, be friends with each other, but not be governed by the institutions of the European Union. And I promise you, what you've seen in 2016 is just a start. This will roll on until this European project in its current form is dead.
And you think it will be dead next year?
Well, I can't tell you, whether it's dead next year or whether it takes longer, I don't know. But we're watching the European project dying before our eyes, and I'm very pleased about it, because I didn't just want the United Kingdom out of the European Union, I want Europe out of the European Union. I want a different Europe where friends, nation states can trade and cooperate together, not have laws dictated to them and judged by foreign courts. And that feeling, it's not a right-wing feeling, it's not a left-wing feeling, it's a very popular feeling.
Europe is a union of nation states. It's never going to be. The federal thing is a complete mythology. There's no longer anybody pursuing that. It's a union of 28 nation states who would be much weaker politically if they were apart, much less able to deal with, say, the migrant crisis and other things, much more influential and able to look after our interests if we cooperate. And when we cooperate, we're more valuable to the Americans as a leading player in the European Union, and our economies thrive with the biggest free trade area in the world. The problem is, ever since the 2006, 2007, 2008 financial crisis, we've had genuine hardship, people left behind. The problems get difficult, but still, we're sovereign states in key things. The migrant crisis Nigel mentions. We've never given up control of our borders over non-EU citizens. Whether we take in Syrians, Afghans, Indians, Pakistanis, entirely a matter for a British government, our border controls, nothing to do with Brussels. Actually, we can tackle it if we work with allies in going both to the source, the control, stopping people getting to the mainland of Europe in the first place, deciding how we actually share the burden where there's genuine claims for asylum from warfare in which we're participating, all those things. The trouble is, the modern world is very, very complicated, and if you're a politician in government, you have difficult problems to which you can't give easy answers. But simplistic protests, be it a right or left, Syriza in Greece or Beppe Grillo in Italy, are escapism.
Or Nigel Farage here, I suppose.
And the reality is we're better off if we maximise our clout in the world by cooperating with our neighbours.
Nigel Farage, are you just throwing hand grenades from the sidelines before running off to America?
I mean, poor old Ken. I mean, he's a lovely bloke, but he's completely out of date. The idea that we are better off inside the European Union to operate with America. Ken, you may have missed this, but a guy called Donald J. Trump becomes the president on January the 20th, and thank goodness for that, Because at last there's a man in the White House who is pro-Britain, who wants us to have a bilateral trade deal with America as quickly as possible and sees an independent United Kingdom as a genuine bridge to the rest of Europe and indeed to the rest of the NATO members. The world has moved on and there'll be more Beppe Grillos. Ken, this project isn't about cooperation. This project is about the assimilation of power in Brussels. Any country that has signed up to the Eurozone, and you, by the way, wanted to sign us up to it, and thank God we didn't listen to you. Any country that signs up to that has given away its ability to set its own
Let me briefly get Ken Clark to respond to that, because we're just running out of time. Ken Clark, isn't the truth that people are listening to Nigel Farage and not you?
But they're listening to him for the long reasons of Nigel had a triumph. That we wouldn't have had a referendum but for Nigel Farage. And it was Nigel Farage that won the argument. Boris just helped to make it respectable and provided the photo opportunities. But let me just give a specific example. I mean, well, Trump is a protectionist. America hasn't signed a trade deal with anybody for 5 years. They'll sign a nice deal. Won't have much content without a lot of effort. The EU, the combined efforts of the EU, were trying to get us a deal. It's hard work. Nigel campaigning in the referendum posed in front of a picture of a lot of Syrians and Afghans trying to cross the border into Croatia. He did not explain that if any of these people wanted to come to Britain, it was the British government controlling its border would decide whether we admitted them or not.
We must leave it there.
It had nothing to do with Brussels. This is simplistic, rather very, I hate to use the words, it's become a cliche, populist avoiding of the real problems.
I'm afraid we must leave it there, gentlemen.
People who can tackle problems, not professional comedians like Beppe Grillo.
We'll bring you both back, I hope, very soon. But thank you both very much indeed. Ken Clark and Nigel Farage.
Thank you.
Now, the Obama administration has said relations with China could be undermined following last week's telephone call between President-elect Donald Trump and the Taiwanese president. It came as the White House reiterated American support for the decades-old One China policy. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris joins us now. So why has this phone call been quite such a problem, Kylie?
Well, John, not since 1979 has there been direct contact between the presidents in Taipei and here in Washington. That out of deference to Beijing's regarding of Taiwan as one of its own provinces rather than a nation in its own right. That all changed with this phone call. At first, it was thought to have been some kind of diplomatic bungling by Trump, but what's becoming ever clearer is that this was actually a calculated choice at the urging of advisors who want to see him reset the relationship with China and use Taiwanese democracy as an instrument to do that. Beijing, as you might expect, responded rather sternly, but also kind of put it down to Mr. Trump's inexperience. They won't give him that again. But certainly the White House now has just spoken, just to remind everyone what the policy is and why this phone call was in no way helpful.
Some of the progress that we have made in our relationship with China could be undermined by this issue flaring up. It's also unclear how the people who live in Taiwan benefit from this issue flaring up.
The reality is that this flaring may well represent the kind of fanning of the first flames of a new relationship between the US and China. But this is diplomacy by tweeting currently. There isn't a lot of detail until a Secretary of State is appointed. We don't really know how far Donald Trump will be prepared to take this.
Kylie Morris. Now, as Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney has done much to steady the national ship since this summer's Brexit vote. But in a speech in Liverpool tonight, he's admitted that workers are having to endure a decade of decline in real wages, the worst period since the 1860s, and is calling on the government to do more to tackle inequality in society. We'll hear from the Governor in a moment, but first, our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy, has this.
Britain in the 1860s, a society damaged by years of financial crises, deep divisions between the rich and poor, and a decade with no wage growth. A decade which today Mark Carney invoked, reminding us it led to the rise of Karl Marx and his revolutionary demand to end all capitalism. Mark Carney isn't the first person to warn of a lost decade in recent weeks, but he is by far the most senior figure in Britain's economic establishment to do so. And with it, a warning that the Bank of England can only do so much to help. And now the heavy lifting to address Britain's long-term economic problems must be done by the government itself. Carney knows the Bank of England's record is in question, 8 years on from the worst financial crisis in living memory, and people don't feel any better off despite years of ultra-low interest rates, a criticism also echoed by the Prime Minister herself. But it's not a criticism he accepts. On the defensive today, Carney claims that rock-bottom rates since 2008 have actually raised UK growth by 8 percentage points. Without that, wages would have been £2,000 a year lower for every worker, and 1.5 million more people would have lost their jobs. But those actions have only bought the economy time, Carney says. Meanwhile, globalisation and free trade has led to cheaper goods, but jobs get lost overseas. While technology brings new opportunities, yes, but leaves many feeling increasingly insecure about their work. Long-term problems only governments can address. The problem with passing the mantle to government is it has very little money to spend. Increasing productivity is also notoriously difficult to do. And changing the nature of globalisation is a mammoth task for any government. And let's not forget the backdrop to Mr. Carney's message. Trump, Brexit and a wave of populism, much of which is levelled at establishment politics and central bankers just like him.
Well, a little earlier I sat down with Mark Carney for an exclusive interview, and I began with Italy. I asked if we here in the UK should be worried following yesterday's referendum result that there might be a crisis for Italy's banks and for the euro.
Well, governments come and go. Governments in Italy come and go maybe a little more frequently than in other countries. There will be a new government in place, policies in place to move things forward.
But we can't afford the euro to come and go, can we? I mean, well, do you think is it another notch in its fate?
No, look, as Mario Draghi has said, the president of the European Central Bank has said, the euro is unfinished business. There are still a variety of measures that need to be taken by those countries who are part of the euro to make it durable over the long term. It is, of course, important political developments on the continent, and they're of a great interest. But in terms of the impact through our system, we're in an entirely different place than we were even a few years ago. And that's important. So your viewers can focus on more important things.
What you're doing today is delivering a sort of analysis of how it trickles down and how it affects the ordinary man and woman. And that picture is not a happy one. The decade, which you have compared with 1860s, when, growth was zero, where inequality was great, where technology came in and undermined some of what was going on.
Yeah. One of the things I think that contributes very understandably to the level of anxiety that households feel in this economy, in other economies, is the fact that it has, for them, been almost a lost decade of growth. Real incomes in this country have not grown for the last 10 years. And
but
the first time that happened, that is incredible. And that shines a light on inequality. Inequalities that exist in this economy, exist in other economies, and make people question what is being done to address those and what are the fundamental causes of those. Now, that light also gets shone on the Bank of England quite reasonably, and people are asking questions, well, are the policies of the Bank of England contributing to inequality or lessening inequality?
Well, the Prime Minister seems to have answered that with, yes, the Bank of England did contribute.
No, well, with the Prime Minister, I think the Prime Minister has been very clear. She senses these bigger issues, and she recognizes that a comprehensive policy response is required to address them. Now, the question that others have asked is, what does monetary policy do? And I want to answer that question very clearly. First off, monetary policy improves equality, in other words, reduces inequality when you've had a recession. How does it do it? It keeps inflation under control, and it keeps as many people as possible in work.
If we you're like a doctor who has some very bad news in the background, but is telling you the good news at the moment. Sorry, okay, you have a picture of you've saved the economy. We're in the good place that we're in, actually, because the action taken was right. But underneath is a horror story, one in which you have gone back to the 1860s in order to compare it, in which growth is low, in which inequality is incredibly high, and inequality between old and young is also great, where you could actually say that quantitative easing and many of the measures you've taken have made the rich richer and the poor poorer.
Okay, well, you could say that, but you'd be wrong, John, because one of the things we're showing is to go back, and we've looked at the facts, and what's happened since 2010, since interest rates got to as low as they could be, and since quantitative easing began, what's happened to income and wealth inequality? It has gone down from a high level, but it has gone down. So what's happened is the biggest growth in income and the biggest growth in net wealth, basically paying down debt, has come for the least well-off segments of this society.
But forgive me, I've just come back from the Trump campaign, and the complaint they have is the same complaint that workers in Britain have, which is that their real income, their actual, they're still being paid the same as they were back in 2006.
Well, for the U.S. Median incomes, that story is even worse. What's happened is we've had very low growth. Growth in the UK has been better than others in recent years, but we've had very low growth over the course of a decade. People don't feel like they're getting ahead. And on top of everything else, people have an understandable anxiety about some pretty big changes in technology, the nature of work, how secure their jobs are, how secure their children's jobs will be. And so that requires a longer-term path.
The other factors in play are globalization and trade.
Part of addressing these issues is to call a spade a spade. Trade benefits the country as a whole, but it doesn't benefit everybody in the country.
It brings in cheap products that put people out of work.
It requires to fully distribute the benefits of trade. You need to redistribute some of those benefits. You need to help people reskill because new industries become more attractive. And you need to connect all parts of the economy to the global economy. And I think it's a fair charge. I don't think economists...
Sounds like you think Trump was right.
He's not right on the conclusion about trade and the contribution to the economy, but it's the whole suite of policies around trade and recognizing that some are left behind by trade through no fault of their own. How are they helped? How are they put in a position to get new jobs? And what's the role of various policies?
It seems that the scale of what needs to be done is never really recognized. I mean, if you are going to tackle people being thrown out of work by cheap products, new technology, whatever, you've got to have some way of pulling them back into the economy and uplifting them.
Yeah, well, two things. First, I think we should recognize, again, that there are more people at work in this country than there ever have been.
But not necessarily satisfactory work.
Both those statements are correct, and not necessarily in the jobs of the future. And so the question is, how do you best equip them for the jobs of the future so we can move to a post-services economy, a more artisanal economy that would be consistent with the new forms of technology. The other thing we can do is just clearly, objectively, dispassionately lay out the facts so that others, yourself, your viewers, businesses, political parties can determine how best to move forward from that point.
Where does Brexit fit into all this? If we're leaving the European Union, there must be a bit of a period in which we can adjust, and therefore a transitional period, and not a sudden death.
Well, there's... I think we should be clear, people use the term in different ways. The question is, would it be advantageous to have a period of time for firms to adjust, to restructure, after the deal is agreed with the EU? And of course, on the surface, yes, that's absolutely, it's desirable to function.
What happens if we don't get it?
Well,
if we don't get a sort of transition period?
People will adjust. I think what I would say on this point is, I say it's desirable. It's very much desirable from a European perspective in the financial services sector. The government has to weigh a whole host of issues for a whole host of industries and determine its priorities. And only the government can do that.
You started off your speech in Liverpool on the whole issue of the comparison with this lost decade of 1860. And that lost decade, you point out, gave us Karl Marx. What is our lost decade going to give us?
Well, it's the That lost decade gave Karl Marx, but then it also gave subsequent decades of real prosperity and a better balance to globalization.
You always look on the sunny side of the street.
You could remind some others that that is true, even, but that prospect is there as well. There is a real prospect of an open, confident, trading United Kingdom.
But the world in which that is set looks as if it's spinning in an opposite direction.
It is hard to overstate the scale of technological change that has been happening, that will continue, and what it means for the workforce. And that is disorienting, and it also takes identities from people as well. So it's understandable there's this degree of angst. But there's huge opportunity with that. I mean, just the big picture that we've got 3.5 billion people who are plugged in to the sum of human knowledge at the click of a button, that 1 billion people have been taken above the poverty line in the last couple of decades. I mean, huge progress has been made. Since I was born, life expectancy globally is up 2 decades. I mean, this is enormous progress.
What if the other forces, which are beyond your control, nothing to do with the central banks, what if they don't step up to the plate? What if they don't come forward with the kind of measures you seem to feel are needed to secure a peaceful future?
Well, I'm going to end with your theme. I'm going to look optimistically and say that I expect that those will come into place. It will take time. It requires sustained effort. We will continue to do our job, and continue to provide that opportunity for those policies to come into place.
Governor, thank you very much indeed for talking with us.
Thank you, John.
Now, 3 former footballers who claim they were abused broke down in tears today as they launched a new support group to fight for justice for victims of abuse. The Trust lawyer said that as many as 4 football clubs may have paid off alleged victims of abuse. Our sports correspondent, Kamian Zeram, was there.
I just want to say how proud I am of you guys up there. There's some in the background that should be sat here, and all those people and all members of the public that have given us this support and give us this strength to get through this. And we're going to get through it, and we're one big family, and I can't thank everybody enough. I really mean that from the bottom of my heart. Thank you.
Just think, that could be your child. Every time I look at my child, it's hard work.
Right, don't worry.
It is still raw. 2 weeks since Andy Woodward waived his anonymity to speak of the sexual abuse he suffered as a child. 30 years since it happened. He, Steve Waters, and another player launching a trust to support victims, survivors like them. How many clubs does this already involve? Crewe Alexandra, the club they played for back in the early 90s, has launched an investigation. They called their ordeal heartbreaking, but have yet to say sorry. Crewe's manager at the time, Dario Gradi, won't comment until their review is completed. And it's claimed Chelsea, who secretly paid out money to a victim last year, aren't the only club that may have things to hide. The legal team behind the new trust claimed today they had new information from as yet unnamed players that as many as 4 other clubs may have recently paid off victims of child sexual abuse.
I think there are other individuals within the game, past and present, where firmer action should and could have been taken.
Nearly 20 years ago, in 1997, Channel 4's Dispatches exposed allegations of sexual abuse of young players. It included claims about a Bob Higgins, a former youth coach who was still active in football until this weekend, when he was sacked by Fleet Town. Higgins had been charged with 6 counts of child abuse in 1992, but he denied the claims and the charges were dropped. Higgins continued coaching, even though clubs were apparently repeatedly warned about him by the Football League, the police and social services. And it is this story that football fears most, that people knew and did nothing.
It's good that it has come out. It's good that this is happening.
As painful as it is?
Yeah. Like I said, if you only see one little kid's life or helping another adult that's been through it, then it's all worth it.
It is painful, airing traumas that were buried for decades. These players and their families want justice.
Kamian Zerum. To Syria now, where fighting has again intensified around the city of Aleppo. Government forces have attempted to drive deeper into opposition-held areas close to the old city, while rebels have fired mortar shells, killing 2 Russian nurses working in a battlefield hospital. Porrick O'Brien has this.
As opposition forces lose ground, the Battle of Aleppo being waged street by street, building by building, hospital by hospital. The Furkan neighbourhood today, for example, in government-held West Aleppo, in the aftermath of an attack on a Russian field hospital. Filmed under the supervision of the Syrian army, the footage shows a badly injured woman being stretchered out of a tent. The Russian Defence Ministry reported that 2 nurses and a number of civilians had lost their lives. It wasn't the only setback for Russia today. A fighter jet crashed into the Mediterranean after returning from a sortie over Syria. Incidents like this aside, though, the momentum is with the Syrian government and their allies. Over the last fortnight, the rebel-held part of East Aleppo has shrunk considerably. Over the weekend alone, another substantial push into opposition territory. David Knott has trained surgeons on the ground now working in these areas of East Aleppo. Once upon a time they would live message the consultant surgeon looking for medical advice. Now with no equipment, they just send them messages like this one this afternoon.
I had a message from, I asked him what's going on. This is half an hour ago. What's going on there at the moment? And I get the message back. It's shelling all the time. We manage just a little of our casualties. There's no blood, there's no fresh frozen plasma, there's no oxygen generator. It's a horrible situation and we need a safe corridor to evacuate us. Help us. Oh God, help us.
Knott is dealing directly with 7 surgeons. The regime sees them as Al-Nusra Front-style associates, as terrorists in other words.
They've never carried a weapon, they've never done anything to anybody except save people's lives. And they find...
hand on heart, can you say that of all the surgeons you're dealing with, that
Absolutely.
they don't come from a particularly, that they're not Nusra affiliates or...
Absolutely not, absolutely not. Hand on heart, I know them all very well.
The surgeons in question all want to leave, according to Knott, but believe that if they try to access existing corridors into West Aleppo, they'll be detained. Today, the Russians were talking up the possibility of a ceasefire that would allow rebel fighters to leave East Aleppo. And East Aleppo again under heavy bombardment today. Neighbourhood after neighbourhood in ruins.
Porrick O'Brien, after the break. We talk with Louise Casey, whose report says that society is too afraid to admit that some immigrant communities prevent their women from enjoying the full freedoms of being British.
Now, a new report has said minority groups are segregated from British society at worrying levels. Dame Louise Casey has criticised some immigrant communities for their treatment of women. Critics of the report say it has conflated religion, race and cultural practices, and that Dame Louise, who we'll be speaking to in a moment, has singled out Muslims. Our Home Affairs correspondent, Darshna Soni, reports from Birmingham.
It's the busiest time of year for this hardware shop in Birmingham's Acock Green. The area is predominantly white and, according to Louise Casey's report, it's an example of an increasingly segregated Britain.
People do stick to their own quite a bit, it's... when they're in front of you talking foreign language and stuff like that.
Does that make you feel uncomfortable?
It does, yeah.
Mr Vaughan is not alone. There's a myth here that the council once tried to rename Christmas as Winterville for fear of causing offence. The authority denies it ever happened, but it's the kind of widely reported story that has led to unease.
You're always nervous of something you don't know. So if they don't know us and we don't know them, that's where it comes in, fear of the unknown.
And that's why people feel uncomfortable?
Yeah.
Phyllis Proctor has lived here for 30 years. She understands why the government wants to encourage integration, but...
You can't say you've got to live in Sparkhill because you're white and you need to even up the numbers. You can't do that.
Just 2 miles away in Sparkbrook, and it feels as though you're in a different world. In some wards here, the population is almost exclusively Muslim, and Casey's report suggests some residents are completely cut off from the rest of Britain.
Making sure that we're mixing together out in the community.
The Amira Foundation offers English classes and workshops for those fleeing domestic violence. Casey found that some Muslim women are being held back by deeply regressive cultural and religious practices. Some here feel that's deeply patronising.
Do you have friends who are not Muslim? Do you have neighbours? Do you mix with other people? Because that's what she's saying.
I come from a street where it's amazing. There's about 74 people from different diverse backgrounds. And I think we kind of get on as a community, like everybody's just doing what they need to do to survive. And I think from the outside, they kind of want to build this atmosphere that there's this big divide.
Thasmin Yusuf says she has tried to learn English and to find a job.
Whenever I approach to drop my CVs for different local shops, and being Muslim, because I'm wearing my this dress and the hijabs, they refuse.
Casey acknowledges that although she found some Muslims are pulling away from the mainstream, others feel they are being pushed. The review was originally ordered by David Cameron to look at how we all rub along together, at how all of Britain's communities can do more to integrate. But many here say it's done exactly as they feared. It's concentrated on one community in particular, the Muslim community.
That's what they're saying, is when you have these areas which have pockets, and only pockets of Muslim communities, this means that we can't control them. So what they're really saying is that there's something wrong with Muslim values. They are not British values. And how do we make sure that they have British values? We split them out and we integrate them. That's classic assimilationist logic.
Louise Casey finished her investigation some time ago, but publication was reportedly delayed because it contains uncomfortable truths for all of us. The question for government now is how it will address these.
Well, we're joined now by the report's author, Dame Louise Casey. Dame Louise, I mean, you've certainly addressed where communities are 100% Muslim, but what about communities that are 100% white?
Well, actually, the coverage of the report isn't the same as what's in the actual report. I cover a whole range of issues. I talk about the pace of immigration in the country being, frankly, a bit too much in some areas. That would include Eastern European migration. I talk about social and economic deprivation. I look at, frankly, some of the things that I would say are still a cause for national shame, such as young black men between the ages of 18 and 25 are 35% likely to be unemployed, as opposed to their white counterparts. I look at issues of white working class Britain and the levels of, I mean, the Prime Minister talked about it on her way into Downing Street. Kids on free school meals are still significantly less likely to do well in school. But I do then come to the issues of Pakistani heritage and Bangladeshi heritage communities, among others, where actually the social and economic exclusion in those groups are quite profound. So the shame about all of these things is it's a 200-page report. You get moments to explain it to the public. I want people to take the time really to debate these issues.
Example? Do you examine that? I mean, because you take the area of Sparkbrook in Birmingham, and you've got originally very few Asians moving in there, and literally white flight in their presence.
Well, I mean, I think the main thing is that we have to work out what we do about this and how do we talk about it.
Well,
so
let me pick up on what you're suggesting as being done. You say, for example, that we should have much more teaching of English and we should fund it properly for people who need to learn the language. Well, it happens that the very government that commissioned you struck down £45 million of funding last year on language teaching.
John, it's not my job to defend what previous government policy did.
Have you castigated them for doing it?
I clearly, in the report, very, very clearly say that I think we need to make sure that we're spending the right amount of money on English language. 95% of the British public believe that a common denominator across the country is that we all speak English. But let's talk about one of the more uncomfortable truths here, which is in some places like Sparkbrook, despite what your coverage may have shown in that short programme, I don't have to find it that hard to find some women who, even if there were classes available, they're not going to be allowed out or allowed within the community to then go to those ESOL classes. So there is an argument that you have to have specialist provision in some areas of the country, where actually there are, in my view, and I use the word, I'm not going to duck it on this programme just because it's tricky, where I think there are regressive attitudes at play that mean that women, even if they did have classes, would not be able to get to them.
Sadly, that's where we have to end, but we'll try to do more on it in future. Thank you very much for coming in. Breaking news, Russia and China have tonight vetoed a UN Security Council resolution that would have demanded a 7-day truce in Aleppo. It's the 6th time Russia has vetoed a UN resolution in Syria since 2011. That's it.
From all of us here, that's Channel 4 News.
Good evening.